Yeah, I just started the recording. I want to welcome everyone again. This is Eli Sagor. I'm an extension specialist with the University of Minnesota based at the Cloquet Forestry Center. Really glad to have you all here for the October, can't believe it's already October, webinar. This is the 10th, I guess it would be, in our series this year. Lane Mosier has organized and hosted most of our webinars this year, but I'm here today with John Knott. John is with the U.S. Forest Service. He's with the FIA program, Forest Inventory and Analysis. And we asked John to give us an update on what he knows and what he and his colleagues and others have learned about forest carbon. And he's got a talk this morning that's going to largely, after an overview of FIA, is going to focus in on a few different studies. Again, generally large-scale studies that offer insights into what's going on in our forests with respect to carbon. Before we begin, I want to just quickly draw your attention to a couple of other upcoming programs. November 9th, just a couple of weeks off, 3 weeks off or so, we're offering a program on timber taxation. So everything you ever wanted to know or wish you didn't have to know maybe about timber taxation, that's going to be at the Black Bear Casino in Cloquet. We've got Mike Kilgore from the Department of Forest Resources here at the U, and Tammy Cushing. Tammy's at the University of Florida. She's a national expert on timber taxation. Again, that's November 9th in Cloquet. Next month, our webinar is the Glyphosate Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment. So we'll hear from our tribal partners about an update to that Lake States Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment. Many of you, of course, are going to be going to the SAF conference, and we'll see each other there. So that's a lot going on this fall. I do want to draw your attention to the Research and Practice Review. That event we hold usually in January. This year it's going to be in mid-February. And the call for presentations is open now. You'll find that on our website. We encourage you, whether you're a researcher or a practitioner, to go ahead and put your ideas in. It's the Research and Practice Review. And we would like to see all kinds of different voices presenting at that event. Again, the event is February 21st, but we'd love to have your proposals anytime. That is open now. I think I'll leave it at that. Enough preamble. John, I'll hand the screen to you. We are recording. And John Knott, you're on.
All right. Thanks, Eli, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for joining today. Yeah, like Eli said, I'm with the Forest Inventory Analysis program and part of the Carbon Science group here in FIA. And this work that I'm going to talk about today really wouldn't happen without a huge amount of effort from the field crews and the information management staff that get us this data in a usable form. And then a whole bunch of Forest Service and other agency and university cooperators who actually do this work with us. It's a relatively small group of us in the Carbon Science group, but we have this quite large network that we've built to actually do some of these pretty cool things regarding forest carbon. So like Eli said, I'll start with just sort of a brief overview of what FIA is. And then I'll dive into a few studies that we've been doing here in the Upper Midwest that have kind of, a couple of them have sort of expanded, but at least were initialized here. So the Forest Inventory Analysis Program, or FIA, is the National Forest Inventory of the United States. We're considered to be one of the most comprehensive forest inventories in the world. We operate with these four main bands: data acquisition, information management, analysis, techniques, and we expand across all of these different portfolio areas. So different Farm Bill priority areas. Again, circled here, carbon is just one of them, and we work quite closely with others working on these other sort of portfolios or topic areas. And so FIA has just a ton of data. So we have 350,000 FIA plots that are across the contiguous lower 48 states, Alaska, Hawaii, the US territories, and affiliated islands. And of those plots, about a third of them that actually fall on forested land, we send out a field crew to go measure the trees, to collect data about the plots. So we have attributes that are related to things like land use and ownership for all of those plots, and then additional on-the-ground measurements of trees, disturbance, deadwood and soils on some subset of the plots. So just a whole ton of data, a whole ton of attributes related to the different attributes of the forests. So just a lot that's all publicly available, free to use, and I'll share a link to that in a little bit. And so one of the cool things about FIA is that it's a probability-based sampling design. So instead of being sort of a strategic inventory where they're going out and sort of selecting individual sites to sample at, we sort of take a probability-based sample where we overlay this hexagon grid across the US, and then within each hexagon randomly locate an FIA plot, and then assign each FIA plot to a panel so that the field crews sort of work their way through these different panels. And so over the course of 5 to 7 years in the eastern US and 10 years in the western US, they're actually measuring each of these plots and then circling back to the first plots and working their way through the panels again. So we have this really nice time series of every 5 to 7 years, in the eastern US and 10 years out west. And so some of the plots have been measured about 5 times since they began this, what we call the annualized inventory in the late 90s, early 2000s, as well as some historic data. So the FI program has been around since the 1930s. So there's some of those records that have been digitized. So we're able to see not only these sort of continuous changes recently in forests, but also compare it to what forests might have been back decades ago. And so part of the sort of data analysis pipeline is to take those samples of the trees on the ground and convert them into estimates of things like volume, biomass, and carbon. And so there's a whole bunch of work that's being done to improve those models and how you convert from actual measurements to estimates that are used in a variety of different ways. And one thing about FIA is that we're continuing to evolve. Even though we have been an established program for a very long time, we're continuing to incorporate new data, expand to new areas, improve the ways that we're modeling some of those attributes, trying to become more nationally consistent. So you can see here on the far right, the national scale volume, biomass, carbon models just rolled out a couple weeks ago. So trying to be consistent between the different regions of the US and how we are collecting and analyzing our data. And so again, I sit in the carbon science group, and one of our main research and reporting efforts is the US greenhouse gas inventory. And so what we're trying to do is figure out how much carbon is stored in forests across the US and how much that's changing from year to year. And so what we do is we take those FIA data and we look at how the amount of carbon in those forests changes over time, and try and attribute those changes to different sources. So things like fire, harvest, land use change, and how much each of these different things will lead to either emissions of carbon or removals or sequestration of carbon in those forests. And so recently we've been putting out this resource bulletin that's been focusing on delivering some more smaller scale estimates rather than sort of national scale, so that you can look at how individual states, how much carbon is stored in these different carbon pools in terms of not just the live trees, but also things below ground, the deadwood, the soils, trying to better understand sort of a whole ecosystem approach to forest carbon. And so one thing that people are often surprised by is that the US greenhouse gas inventory and the FI program, it's spatially explicit, right? Where we have those individual plots so we know where they're coming from and we can attribute them to changes on the landscape, but we're not spatially continuous. So we're not necessarily trying to build the best map of carbon every year, but there are a lot of efforts to do so. And so the FIA data provides this really rich reference data for doing that. But what we're finding is that the uncertainties of expanding out and generating that map can sometimes outweigh the uncertainty of just relying on that plot data alone. So it's been a really unique experience seeing how people are using these data to understand forest carbon, not just at FIA plots, but actually looking between the plots. And I'll talk a little bit more about a couple of studies we're doing along those lines coming up here in a little bit. And so one final note is that context and magnitude are really important here. And so our work is being submitted to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and is being used to track how well the US is doing in terms of its climate goals as laid out in the Paris Agreement. And so globally, forests are offsetting about 30% of all global emissions. But in the US, we only offset about 12% of our emissions. And so the question is why? And it turns out the US is one of the top emitters of greenhouse gases. And so forests, even though we have a lot of forest land in the US, it's not necessarily doing as much relative to the rest of the world. And we have, again, sort of here on the bottom right, this giant pool of carbon stored in our forests and a relatively small amount, this tiny little dot that changes from year to year. But those changes can be really important. And especially when we're thinking about changes that are happening sort of permanently, you know, in terms of land use change or large scale disturbances that are going to take forests a really long time to recover. Those changes can be incredibly important in understanding what's sort of the trajectory of US forests and how are we again doing relative to the rest of the world. So if you're interested in reading this, the first QR code at the top is that resource bulletin. It's sort of a short summary, easy to read. And if you want to really get into the weeds, that EPA report is sort of the full greenhouse gas inventory. But what I mentioned earlier is FI data. It's all publicly available. There's a bunch of data and tools, ways of accessing that data available at this website. Listed here at the bottom. So if you're interested in using FIA data or exploring some of the tools that have been developed, feel free to. There's a lot there, and I'm always happy to talk to people and help teach how to use the data. And there's a whole ton of others in FIA that are happy to do so as well. So I think,
hey, John, I'm going to jump in.
Yeah.
So a couple of things. I am amazed at what you had on that previous slide. Can you go back to that? So I saw your slide beforehand. So this whole lower right side, if there was room for that dot on the slide, that would be the carbon stock. And you're saying this little dot over here in the yellow box, that's the amount that it changes. So you pointed this out, but it's a tiny fraction of the stock of the standing kind of amount of carbon that changes in a given year. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So we have a lot that's just, you know, it's forest that's remaining forest land. It's just continuing to hold a lot of carbon. But the amount that's actually changing from year to year is relatively quite small. Yeah.
Okay, and I don't want to derail you because I know you got a lot to go through, but one other question. So one of the things that I find confusing about carbon is the units. So you have, I think it's million metric tons of carbon equivalent per year. Can you just spend a moment explaining or defining that? What does that mean?
Yeah, so this again is sort of for the entire nation. So when we're looking at sort of smaller scale regions, and this will come up later, we're in the dozens of metric tons of carbon stored in forests. But when you start adding it up for the US, you get into the millions of metric tons of carbon. And this again, carbon equivalents per year. It's because there are changes that are other greenhouse gases, and so they try and scale them relative to CO2 emissions, essentially.
Got it. Okay, so methane or other greenhouse gases, they sort of try to get those in the same units.
Exactly. Yep.
Excellent. Thank you for that. All right, I'll let you get back to your slides.
Yeah. So I guess, yeah, I was just saying that this data is all publicly available if anyone wants to check it out. And actually, this is where I was gonna pause for questions anyway. So I don't know if there's any other questions now, or if we should move along to a couple of the other studies.
Well, folks can type fast if they've got any. I'm not seeing any questions right now. So I'll just pause here for a moment, but I think we're probably ready to move on. Oh, there's one. So, okay, we got a couple here. From Henry McCann, what forests and trees are missed by FIA? For example, settlements, windbreaks. What else?
Yeah, so that's actually, those are two that we are trying to continuing to improve how we capture those. So there's the urban FIA program, which is been around for a little while now, but is really picking up, and it's really growing in terms of the number of cities and the inventory. So trying to, yeah, improve our understanding of urban forests. And then the thing about windbreaks, FIA does have this pretty strict definition of what constitutes a forest, but part of the um, expanding to using remote sensing is trying to pick up on some of those areas that are forest-like, but not necessarily forest. Also, things like orchards are considered agriculture and not forests. So there's a lot of things that we aren't measuring that we potentially could be, or that potentially remote sensing or other efforts are being developed to try and capture some of those missed carbon pools. Yeah.
And then, John, we'll do one more and then we'll move on. Slide 7, you showed a map of the US contiguous states, and Pacific Northwest is very dark green. St. Louis County and northern Minnesota and then northern Maine are all dark green. And then the entire state of Colorado. So Molly Schoberg is wondering, why was Colorado all green in that map? It's got to be something about how they measure or report data.
Yeah, so that's Wyoming, and it's Wyoming has yet to finish their second or they're just finishing up their first annualized inventory. So they're on a 10-year cycle. They did sort of their last inventory right before we moved to this annualized inventory. So then it was 10 years later, they went out in the early I think it was maybe 2011, the first, and then it's taken them 10 years to complete that 10-year cycle. And because of COVID, they got delayed a little bit. So we only have one measurement from there. So Wyoming all gets sort of lumped together. This is supposed to be a county level map, but we had to sort of lump it as one giant county, essentially, for the entire state of Wyoming. So it is, yeah, sort of visually it stands out, and it's really just sort of a data limitation kind of thing there.
Great. Thank you, John. That's all the questions for now.
Okay. Yeah, so this next project that I wanted to talk about, we were trying to link together forest composition in terms of which species or forest communities are there with the structure of that forest and the amount of carbon stored there. And so this really started out as sort of a thought experiment, thinking about what are the ways that we define forests? What are some of those characteristics? And, of course, sitting in the carbon science group, biomass and carbon got brought up, but there's so much more. There's the species composition, there's disturbance regimes and disturbance history, there's stand structure, there's sort of these large scale patterns of biogeography that certain forests are the way they are simply because that's the type of species that are found nearby. We have things like physiography and climate and weather patterns that can really contribute a lot to the forests that we have in a given area. And so we wanted to try and tie some of these together and try and build out sort of a more holistic view of a forest and see how we can do that with FI data. And so what we did is we drew up this schematic here on the top right. And so each of the circles represents sort of a community composition that we can get at from FIA. So we can get at the seedlings, the live trees, and the standing deads in terms of which species are there. But then the filled in circles are those that we actually have carbon estimates for. Similarly, the arrows were all sort of the comparisons that we can make between these different demographic components. And you can see the filled in ones, we can track these things through time, sort of the between remeasurements in FIA. And then we can also compare them between each other at a given remeasurement. So we can compare the seedlings to the live trees as sort of what the future of the forest might look like. And then we can also compare the live trees to the standing dead trees to sort of get that backwards view of what the forest used to look like. And so in this project, we want to really zoom in on the stand level or the plot level and really think about the community of co-occurring species rather than just individual species or not even caring about what species were there, which is sort of how a lot of things get lumped when you talk about carbon. And so what we did is we took FIA data from the 3 lake states, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and we compiled all of the FIA plots that had at least 3 measurements. So there were about 5,600 unique plots and a total of almost 21,000 remeasurements. And so what we did is we took the seedlings again, the live trees and the standing dead trees, and we compiled a matrix for each of these that was the number of species, or sorry, the number of species in the plots for each of these different demographic components. And so we had 91 different species that occurred in the seedlings and live trees, and then 73 of them in the standing dead trees. So some of the species just, we never found a standing dead tree of that particular species. And so we tried to answer these 4 main questions, and I'll kind of go through these as we work our way through the results. So the first question was, what are the dominant forest communities of the upper Midwest here in the Great Lakes region? And so we used a model called latent deer clay allocation. I won't go into the details of it, but it essentially is a data-driven way to identify commonly co-occurring species rather than relying on sort of predefined forest types like you can get directly from the FI program or from the Society of American Foresters. There's a lot of different sort of definitions of forest type, but this is really a data-driven approach to look at what are the species co-occurrences in our particular region. And so all 6 of these communities made sense in terms of the species composition. They seem to be ones that we were familiar with in the region, as well as their spatial distributions. They weren't all everywhere. They were sort of each in their own little corner of the region. Here in darker blue is indicating a higher proportion of that particular species in that plot. And so our next step then was to see how much carbon was stored in these forests. And so we used a linear mixed effects model to try and predict carbon stocks based on the community composition. And what we found is that spruce tamarack and quaking aspen ash both had lower than average carbon. And this, again, made sense when you think about an aspen stand like this one in the background. There are, or tend to have, sort of these tall, skinny trees, so not near as much carbon compared to a more dense forest. And spruce tamarack tends to be in sort of those sparse bog-like forests up here in the Midwest. Sugar maple basswood had higher than average carbon. This, again, made sense. You tend to have these sort of more dense, structurally complex forests with often quite large trees. And then the rest fell pretty close to that average dashed line. And this, again, made sense for these particular forest communities. For example, this oak forest, sort of moderate stand density, some large trees, a bit of sort of complexity and layering, but not near as sort of dense and complex as that sugar maple basswood forest. The next question that we were trying to answer was how much are carbon stocks changing over time across the region? And so we used another linear mixed effects model with change in carbon as our response variable. And so our intercept represented sort of a mean change in carbon over time across the region. And so you can see it's above the dashed line at 0. So we saw a general increase in carbon across the region on average. Our fourth question was, how does the community composition and structure affect change in carbon stocks? And so here we have changes that are happening between remeasurements. So sort of those short-term shifts in carbon leading to a decrease, or sorry, short-term shifts in forest composition leading to a decrease in carbon over time. And so this made sense. You don't really get a shift in forest composition without losing some trees and having a different species sort of take over after those other trees are lost. So that would lead to a decrease in carbon. But on the other hand, when we looked at sort of the longer term shifts in composition and thinking about what the forest used to be when you compare the live trees to the standing dead trees, these forests that had more divergence there tended to increase in carbon over time. So this seems to be sort of a shift towards a more carbon dense forest composition over time. And then finally, when we looked at structure, we found that increases in mean diameter and increases in variation in diameter and an increase in skewness towards those larger diameter sizes tended to increase in carbon over time. So again, this logically made sense. Bigger trees, more variation in structure, and sort of a skewed distribution towards larger trees tended to lead to more carbon. So these all made sense logically, which was always a good thing to find. So just to summarize, we found again sort of carbon delineated by these different forest communities, with maple basswood having a lot of carbon and spruce tamarack tending to have the least amount of carbon. But when we think about managing our forests for carbon, managing simply for composition sometimes doesn't make sense because of some of those other factors, like the environmental conditions that you might be able to shift a forest type a little bit, but you're not likely to end up with maple basswood taking over a spruce tamarack bog simply because you want more carbon in your forest. We did see, again, these sort of increases in carbon over time across the region. So the upper Midwest tending to sequester carbon. And we saw sort of this contrast between short-term, sort of between remeasurement shifts in composition leading to a decrease in carbon, but sort of long-term trajectories in terms of composition tended to be also linked to increases in live carbon over time. And again, the whole point about structure, just if you have bigger trees, you have more carbon. So if you're interested in reading this paper, here's a link to it, or a QR code to it as well. So I think this will be another good point to stop for a couple of minutes for a few more questions before we jump into the last two studies that are sort of linked together around remote sensing of forests.
All right, great, John. I did have a question. I missed a couple that were posted to the Q&A. That's my bad earlier, but I responded to one of those in the chat. And Jen had asked me to post a link to the FIA site from your presentation. So I'll go looking for that and make sure that we get it to you. I think, Jen, that I do have a copy of John's slides, so I'll try to get that and put it in the chat. The other question that I missed earlier is this: how was the below ground biomass calculated in Domke et al. 2023? So how did they look at below ground? Right.
So there are part of the efforts for these biomass or improved biomass models is essentially it's a correlation between how much biomass is above ground to below ground, right? So the models are really built well for estimating how much above ground biomass there is based on the diameter and the height of the tree. And then based on that, there's a ratio for how much is below ground. And so we actually found a potential bug early in the new models that some species had an enormous amount of below ground biomass, and it was truly just a bug in the code. And so we're glad that we caught that before pushing out these new models. But yeah, it is a bit of a difficult situation where you aren't actually looking at anything below ground. You're basing it all on what is above measured above the ground. Yeah.
That's interesting, because it seems it's not a topic I know much about, but it seems like you'd have really big differences based on peat versus mineral soils and other kinds of things. But I guess I'm sure you've obviously thought of all that. And
Yeah. So I was referring to the below ground biomass. There are also soil samples that are being collected to develop models of forest soil carbon as well. So that's sort of a whole other aspect of it as well.
Yes, it
is. The soil parts are based off of soil sampling that occurs.
So you're talking about roots as below ground biomass, and that's distinct from carbon stored in the soil itself, like peat.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, excellent.
Yep.
So the next question here, Molly had another question. I understand that FIA data isn't assessing the sphagnum moss and underlying soil. Maybe this is what we were just talking about. But she says, I wonder how much of that component of a spruce tamarack stand may be storing carbon. So how much the below ground? We know that's a very large pool. Anything to add?
Yeah, exactly. That's one of the key things about some of these sort of, or what we were looking at in terms of live above ground biomass or carbon. There is a lot going on below ground, and we're continuing to improve sort of how we model those things based on forest type and that sort of thing. And yeah, like spruce tamarack bogs can have a ton of below ground carbon, and if we didn't look at soil carbon, but it would be interesting to go back and see, how much or do things sort of equal out a little bit more in terms of some of those other low above ground biomass forests having a lot below ground biomass or soil carbon. Yeah.
All right, we've got one more and then we'll move on. In this study, were you able to compare and contrast the annual rate of net sequestration between the species cohorts?
We did. Let me see if it showed up. So we did in the paper, I believe, have some sort of discussion about that. The one issue is that we are so this model is actually looking at the community composition of a forest. So each plot is a proportion of each of the communities. It's not just a sort of a label or a categorization of forests. So it is a little bit difficult to delineate how much is actually being sequestered by a particular forest type within a forest, if that makes sense. There's sort of a multiple steps that need to be taken to get to the individual cohorts from the forest community composition.
Excellent. Thanks, John. I think that's all we've got for now. So you're on.
Okay. Great. Well, these last two projects, I kind of lumped them together. The first project was published recently, and the other one is still under ongoing. So but they're both focusing on ways of using remote sensing to understand forest dynamics in terms of biomass and composition, and some of the challenges of doing so. So this, as I've been talking about throughout this presentation, FIA data are just like this incredible tool for understanding how forests work and studying forest carbon. And so the Washington office put together this little schematic of sort of what the data journey looks like as we move from on the ground measurements to estimates of sequestration of carbon in those forests. But at the same time, there's been this push to use remote sensing for estimating biomass or carbon at regional to global scales. So this is a map from the JEDI space-based LiDAR that they produce this map of above ground biomass density. And so there's a lot of people interested in how do we use remote sensing to expand beyond just our plot level estimates. And it's coming from a whole bunch of people that are interested in this. Again, sort of the national and international forest inventories and greenhouse gas inventory folks. Carbon markets and offset programs are looking to use remote sensing to better understand how they are dishing out their carbon credits to forests that they're hoping are sequestering carbon to offset emissions. Land managers and ecologists are really interested in how they are managing their land and whether or how their forests are changing over time. Without having to set up a whole forest inventory, can we use remote sensing to learn about our forests from above? And so there's a whole bunch of questions that come up when you start thinking about using remotely sensed data. There's a ton of different sources that range from things being flown in drones and airplanes, a relatively short distance above the canopy, to things that are in outer space, satellite-based sensors and sensors that are aboard the International Space Station, that are all producing data in a variety of different forms, a whole bunch of different metrics that can be derived from the data. And so there's just tons of questions about, what's the best way to do this. And so one question that we came up with in one of our projects was, well, what about outliers? We're starting to see some of these strange mismatches between remote sensing and FIA data, and how do we deal with them? And so we started picking out, okay, what ones are we actually, or what are some of the things that we might be seeing in our data? And so one that came up was that FIA plots have a different size and different shape than pixels. So you have vegetation that's around an FIA plot that's contributing to the pixel value that's being extracted for that plot. If you're using something like LiDAR and you're clipping out sort of the LiDAR point cloud to that particular FIA plot, you have trees that are measured by FIA, but some of that tree isn't included in the point cloud. And vice versa, you might have a tree that's outside of the plot that leans over a little bit. And so that is included in the point cloud, but isn't measured by FIA. You also have things like small trees or understory vegetation that FIA doesn't measure or doesn't calculate a carbon estimate for, but it can be picked up by remote sensing. So there's like a bunch of these different sort of plot level mismatches, as well as things that happen like temporal mismatches. You can have LiDAR data that gets collected in one year, and then harvest or disturbance happens, and then the FIA field crew goes out and they're no longer able to measure those trees because they're gone. Or you might have things like non-response. So maybe FIA crews are coming out the same year that the LiDAR data is being collected, but they aren't allowed on that plot because the it's privately owned land and the landowner denied access, or maybe there were hazardous conditions, they weren't able to actually get to the plot. And then sometimes we have things like statistical or biological outliers. Perhaps, again, going back to this aspen stand, you have a lot of tall, skinny trees, and it might look like a large closed canopy to a sensor in space, but when you're actually on the ground, you realize, hey, we just have a lot of tall, skinny trees and a lot less biomass here than you might expect based on what remote sensing was seeing for this particular forest. And so what we did is we tried to, again, use a case study and actually see how this plays out. What do these effects do these outliers have? And so we took about 300 FIA plots from Sawyer County in Wisconsin to get estimates of above ground biomass. And then we paired that with countywide aerial laser scanning, or ALS LiDAR, that was flown by plane in 2017. And we started to build these models of mean return height from LiDAR versus above ground biomass from FIA, and built these nonlinear models to predict biomass from our LiDAR heights. And so what we started doing then is well, let's add or remove these things that are potentially outliers and see how it affects that relationship. And what we're finding is that the shape of the relationship is pretty much the same when you add or remove outliers. Those lines are all pretty closely overlapping with one another. So not huge differences in that predicted relationship. We did find a few things like the statistically significant outliers, those that were sort of farthest from that predicted line, tended to be above the predicted value. So, sort of higher than expected biomass based compared to its height. And then things like GPS errors were sort of as often above and below the line. So being off by a few meters when you're collecting your data actually didn't make as much of an impact. You're as likely to be north as you are south, or east as west. So things sort of cancel out. Sometimes you're off by a little bit in a more carbon or biomass, higher biomass area, or you're off by a little bit in a lower biomass area. But when you start having a bunch of samples from FIA, those start to cancel each other out. And so really it came down to a lot of our outliers were decisions about, do we include or exclude things that are 0 or NA, or things that are perhaps just missed by FIA, rather than actually being a sort of true 0. What we wanted to do, though, is not just look at the shape of that relationship, but actually expand this out to the population level. So getting an estimate of mean above ground biomass for the county, and see how that compares when you start adding or removing these outliers. And so we had two main estimators: the model assisted estimator on the y-axis, which is based off of that model of biomass based on the LiDAR return heights. And then on the x-axis, the expansion estimator, which was based on FIA data alone and is basically a weighted mean value. And so what we found is that these estimates are all falling below the 1-to-1 line. So if you're using that expansion estimator, you're overestimating biomass relative to the model assisted estimator. We're also seeing narrower confidence intervals for the model assisted estimators. So you're having improved precision when you're using remote sensing. So there is a lot of value in using remote sensing to reduce our uncertainties, improve our precision of our estimates. And then we also found that the confidence intervals were overlapping more often for the model assisted estimator. And so we're seeing these smaller shifts when you include or exclude outliers when you're using that model assisted estimator. So again, it seems like remote sensing is really doing its job at improving our estimates of forest biomass. And so what we are finding, again, is just that these outliers are really tough to deal with. There's a lot of them. They are caused by a lot of different things. And those impacts can be dependent on the type of estimator that you're using. If you're using remote sensing simply to pick out outliers, but then relying on sort of a FIA only type estimator, it can have a lot more impacts than if you're actually incorporating the information from remote sensing. There are a lot of other ways to deal with outliers. We use sort of this remove or retain sort of approach, but there are ways to compensate for outliers by adjusting sampling sizes and doing some interpolations and that sort of thing. But ultimately, it came down to documenting what you're doing can really aid your interpretation. And so as a forest manager might start incorporating some of these tools, understanding reasons why things aren't looking quite right can really improve our understanding of our forests, and how we can use remote sensing as a tool, and to provide more insight into what those estimates of biomass actually mean. And really it boils down to this question of, are we measuring what we think we're measuring? And so I'll leave you quickly with this QR code, and then I'll briefly talk about that third project before I think going to some final questions. So this third project what is being led by excuse me, by Antonio Guzman at the University of Minnesota. He's a postdoc in Janine Cavendish-Bear's lab. And so the thought here is how do we use remote sensing to not just look at biomass, but actually the composition of those forests? And so this, we're instead of linking LiDAR data with the FI plots, we're linking hyperspectral data from the DESIS satellite sensor that's aboard the International Space Station. And so I included this project because it started out, we were just interested in Minnesota and Wisconsin, but we realized, hey, there's a potential to expand this to a majority of the Eastern US. And so what Antonio has been doing is he's been building these models to link the hyperspectral data with the FIA plots, and then use the information on the species composition of those FI plots to identify phylogenetically related forest communities that can then be linked with that hyperspectral data to have sort of a hyperspectral signature of a particular forest community. And so here each axis of that ordination sort of represents a different forest community that can then be mapped on to any area that DESIS satellite passed over. And so you can see on the left sort of an RGB image just sort of picking out where forests are, and then in the middle mapping out the beta diversity from that ordination shows the different communities. And so you can see they're all sort of in their individual parts of the landscape, sort of similar to that first study where we were showing how each individual community was sort of showing up in different FIA plots. And so then the next step is that you can take those communities and disaggregate them into their component species and try and map out, for example, where red oak is, or where big tooth aspen or red pine, how those sort of fall out across the landscape, and get going from not just the community level, but actually all the way down to the species level as well. And so this is ongoing work. Again, we're continuing to build better models and incorporate some other metrics from our hyperspectral data. But it's really pointing to the utility of remote sensing to sort of see beyond the FIA plot. In some cases, remote sensing has been used to reduce ground sampling efforts. So instead of having to have 200 FIA plots, maybe we can have 100 with additional remote sensing to get estimates of biomass or carbon or community composition. It's also, let us expand to new areas and to see what forests are like between FI plots or in areas where we can't get a field crew out to. A lot of remote sensing has a much shorter return interval than FIA, so changes can be detected within a season for some of the satellite-based sensors, or a lot of state and county imagery is often flown at annual or sometimes a 5-year interval, which can be quicker than what FIA gets back to those plots. And so it's really been an important tool to uncover some of these patterns in species diversity, structure, biomass, and trying to sort of link some of those things that we weren't able to do with just FIA data in that first study that I talked about, sort of that schematic on the right, with using remote sensing, we can kind of, get at some of those things and try and build linkages in unique ways and look at aspects of the forest that we just can't get at with FI data alone. But one important note is that FI data is still sort of the most comprehensive forest inventory and one of the best reference data sets available for building those models in the first place. So even though remote sensing might help us see beyond FIA, there's still a lot of important information from FIA that goes into building those models and generating those maps that it is really an incredibly valuable resource. And again, it's all publicly available. So if anyone is interested in using it, you're more than welcome to. So yeah, with that, I'll wrap up there with that those last two projects, and again, happy to take more questions about those, or folks had thought of questions from the previous studies as well. I'm happy to answer some more questions, and again, here's that link to the FI website if you're interested in digging into some of the data. Thanks, everyone.
Great. John, thank you again. Really great presentation. You covered a lot of ground. And I'm not seeing any questions now, so I've got one of my own. And I wonder what this is kind of a tough one. It's the $1 million question, but I think the big question a lot of foresters and land managers have is what can we do to increase carbon sequestration and or storage, depending on perspective and whatever, through forest management activities. And of course, your talk was at a different scale. You focused on large scale studies and methods of analysis and some other things. But I wonder if there are general conclusions that you can draw from either this work or other things that would make sense to discuss here, or is that just a different enough and big enough question that we can't really cover it today?
Yeah, I mean, it really is the $1 million question, like you said. It is pretty much everything is context dependent. That's sort of a given in any sort of natural system. And yeah, I guess there's a lot to unpack there. A few things that we've found over the years, and with that study of remote sensing for biomass estimation was driven by a request for from a carbon market of how do we use remote sensing for estimating biomass. And at the same time, we're seeing some of those programs that that's what they're trying to do, is sequester more carbon in forests, but wildfires in California wiped out like tons of carbon stores, and so in a year you can have tons of emissions from a seemingly natural cause. Again, some of it is climate change driven, but at the same time, there's so much variability in what happens to our forests that we can be great at measuring carbon, but we aren't always great at predicting what's going to happen to that carbon.
Yeah, that's right. We got a question in from Henry again to confirm. FIA state level estimates of stocks and fluxes do not currently incorporate remote sensing data. Is your research meant to explore how to incorporate remote sensing into these estimates going forward?
Yeah. So right now, remote sensing within the FI program itself is primarily just being used to determine whether or not we need to go out to that plot. Is it potentially a forested plot? Should we send out a field crew there? And so yes, a lot of this work is trying to figure out how do we incorporate remote sensing to eventually be able to produce those maps of carbon for the any scale. How do we actually use remote sensing rather than trying to actually incorporate it as a standard estimate within some of those state level reports and that sort of thing. There's a lot of people working on this right now within Forest Service and at a whole bunch of different universities. My off the record opinion is that I think that we'll be moving that direction eventually, but there is still a lot of uncertainty of how do we best do this? And so that's a lot of the questions that I've been interested in exploring is, yeah, how do we do this while maintaining data integrity and that sort of thing?
Yeah. Well, John, thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions right now.